April 28, 1952. The peace talks began last July, and it's taken this long for the UN side to finally put together a peace package proposal for an armistice. But this week they finally do. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the POW screening by the UN to see who would go back to North Korea or Communist China and who would violently resist going came to an end, with the shocking result that most of the prisoners held would refuse to go. Hey, remember a few weeks ago when I said that Ike, Dwight Eisenhower, American World War II hero and now NATO commander in Europe, asked U.S. President Harry Truman to relieve him of his military duties so he can run for president himself? Remember that? Well, this week on April 28th, Truman accepts Ike's request to be relieved. It will not go into effect until June 1st officially, but who is going to replace Eisenhower in Europe? Truman chooses none other than UN Commander Matt Ridgway. Well, for the U.S. military, he's Far Eastern Forces commander, but either way, it means he'll be gone from this theater. And who would replace Ridgway as UN Forces commander? Truman decides it shall be Mark Clark, whom you may well remember from the Italian campaign in my coverage of World War II. Clark's last assignment was Chief of U.S. Army Field Forces. He will not take over in Korea for another couple weeks, though. I do wonder how he might deal with South Korean President Syngman Rhee. Ridgway and Truman have, at times, really had their hands full with him, and he still refuses to be cowed. He drops hints that maybe he'll remove the ROK Army, the South Korean Army, from UN control. One of his official spokesmen even announced the ROK would veto any armistice signed under dishonorable circumstances, and that the South Korean negotiator did not actually represent the country since the UN had appointed him. And in a public statement on April 14th, Rhee disdained talk of a ceasefire. "I am still opposed to any ceasefire which leaves our country divided," he said. "No matter what arguments others may make, we are determined to unify our fatherland with our own hands." Well, the talks to create a ceasefire took a real hit last week anyhow, without Rhee doing anything. After the explosive POW screening numbers, it seems from the actions of the communists, at least at the staff officer level, that the closed meetings at the Panmunjom peace talks are about to end. This week on the 24th, Tsai Chang-wen threatens to return to open meetings. And on the 25th, he makes good on his threat, with his team issuing a long public summary of everything they talked about in April, which impels the UN to release their own report. If you wonder how Ridgway and Chief UN Delegate Turner Joy feel about the sessions being open or secret, neither of them cares much at just this point, since the separate elements of the package deal they're putting together have all become fully public knowledge in the press anyhow. But the military and political leaders in Washington disagreed. The open sessions generated more heat than light, they maintained, and they therefore preferred an executive meeting of the plenary conference. Then, if the communists disregarded the understanding to gain the propaganda initiative, or if they turned down the suggestion for the executive meetings, the onus for failure to reach agreement would fall upon the enemy. A package deal being put together, you say? Yep, and April 28th, 1952, is a really big day. See, the liaison officers have set up a plenary conference for that date, right? The delegates meet, Turner Joy requests an executive session, and after a brief recess, the communists agree. Here's what happens at the session. Joy goes over the armistice issues still to be agreed upon in great detail, and then lays out the UN solution, which has been written up into a complete draft of an armistice. All mention of airfields and any rebuilding or building thereof post-armistice has been deleted. It's just not mentioned. And the Neutral Nations Supervisory Committee, which will ensure that everybody is sticking to the terms of the armistice, is to be formed by Switzerland, Sweden, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. The POW disposition issue is written up in a single paragraph. All prisoners of war held in the custody of each side at the time this armistice agreement becomes effective shall be released and repatriated as soon as possible. The release and repatriation of such prisoners of war shall be effected in conformity with lists which have been exchanged and have been checked by the respective sides prior to the signing of this armistice agreement. This means the plan is for the 70,000 POWs the UN holds who would return north without being forced would be exchanged for the 12,000 in enemy custody. And the non-repatriates would be reclassified into something other than POW status. Walter Hermes writes that the package proposal created as much stir as a pebble dropped into the ocean. Communist Chief Delegate Nam Il says, "Our side fails to see how your proposal this morning can really be of help to the overall settlement of the remaining issues," and he calls for an indefinite recess. This is not particularly surprising, since they kind of knew the UN positions already. It does, however, only really reduce the number of issues to be solved down to one: the number of POWs to be repatriated. As long as there is the gaping distance of 50,000 or so names between what the UN offers to send back and what the communists expect, though, there are not bright hopes for an armistice. When told that this offer is final and irrevocable, Nam proposes an indefinite recess. This does not much worry Turner, Joy and company, since they all realize Nam cannot make policy decisions without consulting Peking and Pyongyang. Yet, despite the indifferent reception that the enemy had given the package proposal, this was a key moment in the negotiations. The UNC had officially fallen back upon its final and irrevocable position, and the period of debate was over. There had been no ultimatum or threat of increased activity at the front, but the UN command had passed the crossroads and embarked upon a firm course. Patience and firmness, the old standbys, were to be the chief weapons in the battles that lay ahead rather than force. In the meantime, the battle at the front would go on as it had all winter, essentially a defensive war on both sides. Fought within carefully defined boundaries and under tacit rules, the war of the active defense nonetheless continued and took its daily toll of casualties. Now, a little more about the screening. While it was in progress, Van Fleet told Ridgway the anti-communist POWs were being segregated and removed to the mainland from Koje-Do Island. This does mean that they'll need more personnel to organize and run what would need to be more camps and compounds. But Van Fleet thinks doing this will reduce the number of in-camp incidents of violence. That it has done, but there is a downside to that as well. See, removing the anti-communists from compounds and replacing them with communists does a lot to strengthen the position of the compound leaders, who now have total support from the inmates of their compounds and are united in their anti-UN efforts. Their opposition has been transferred to the mainland, so they're really upping the political unrest right now. They actually get some lucky help with this. See, up until now, the ROK, South Koreans, has been responsible for the grain content of prisoner rations. But the ROK told 8th Army last month they can no longer do this. So Van Fleet told 2nd Logistical Command they have to now get grain through the U.S. Army. However, UN Civil Assistance Command was not able to supply grain in the ratio half rice and half other grains without a lot of advance notice to put it together. So what the prisoners get just now is 1/3 rice, 1/3 barley, and 1/3 wheat. And this has caused a huge amount of complaining from the POWs. And hey, remember that there were 7 compounds that completely refused the screening? Well, if they ever are to be screened, Van Fleet knows a fair amount of force will have to be used and there will be casualties. He is actually preparing that force this week, and today, the 28th, he tells Ridgway those already screened would probably have some sort of violent demonstration when the UN sends troops into those holdout compounds. So Ridgway moves the 3rd Battalion from the 9th Infantry to Koje-Do to reinforce the 38th Infantry there, and the 1st Battalion of the 15th Infantry and the ROK 20th Regiment to nearby Pusan. He doesn't actually want to do any more screening at all, though, right? He writes this to the Joint Chiefs. These compounds are well organized, and effective control cannot be exercised within them without use of such great degree of force as might verge on the brutal and result in killing and wounding quite a number of inmates. While I can exercise such screening, I believe that the risk of violence and violence involved, both to UN personnel and to the inmates themselves, would not warrant this course of action. Further, the unfavorable publicity which would probably result would provide immediate and effective communist propaganda material. He says they should do what they unofficially did 2 weeks ago and just say the POWs in those compounds all desire repatriation. Of course, some of them might actually not desire this in the slightest, but Ridgway's request is approved, and it is now official. And the Joint Chiefs figure any of those guys who really don't want to go back will somehow make it known. Sure, somehow. And here are a couple of notes to end the week. On the 25th, aerial photos taken over Pyongyang show that by gathering huge amounts of sand, the communists seem to intend to make the airfield there operational once more. And remember last week I talked about some Marine helicopter operations? Yeah, well, the HRS-1 choppers, including those that were involved last week, are all grounded on the 26th because of some sort of issue with the tail rotors. It may take several weeks before the issue is fixed. And that is this week of the war, with what should be real headline news when the UN gives a peace package proposal for an armistice, but which doesn't really arouse much interest from the other side at all. It's the final one, supposedly, to end this limited war, this war that isn't a war. But what does that really mean? I mean, when you're on the front lines and the shooting starts, does it feel limited? The thing is, with the whole don't do any offensives thing, when someone does get killed, it really is anathema for those in Tokyo and Washington, D.C. running the show for the UN. And they complain, and they point fingers, and officers get punished, as if those officers are not literally the ones who care the most about the lives of the soldiers entrusted to them. Here's a very long quote from T.R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War about just that to end today, and it really cuts to the heart of things. Online, there was no such thing as a limited war. When the shooting started online, no man 1,000 miles away could tell the man in combat what or what not to do. But there is no such thing as war, even limited war, without losses. As the months passed and 1952 deepened, the war that was not a war went on endlessly. Every night the guns on each side cannonaded. Every night the patrols went out. Every night men died. Frustration grew in government, in generals, while the guns sounded and the talks about the peace table droned on. And, caught in a communist trap, the moral courage of some leaders grew less. The pressure on Tokyo to hold down the losses never ceased. In Korea, on the ground, it intensified. It was no longer possible to permit juniors any latitude or any possibility for error. Soon, battalion commanders led platoons, and general officers directed company actions, for the loss of one patrol could ruin the career of a colonel. In one way, it was an efficient system. It worked, for the lines were stable, and no senior officer had enough to do. But the damage done to the Army command structure would be long in healing. If a new war came someday, there would be colonels and generals who had been lieutenants and captains in Korea, who had their basic lessons still to learn. Food for thought. And there is much similar food for thought coming each and every week as we watch this conflict unfold and detail its ramifications for the world in general. Be part of this adventure by joining the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And Greg Huerty, I think that's how you say it, is the Army member of the week here. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.